I had been planning the hike for weeks. The trail I chose wasn't one of the most popular ones, but it was still known well enough that I figured I wouldn't be completely alone the entire way. I liked being out in nature by myself, away from noise and people, but I didn't like the idea of being so far from everyone that if something went wrong, no one would ever know. This trail stretched about 18 miles through thick forest and rocky hills before finally looping back down into the valley. The terrain was said to be difficult but manageable if you came prepared. I thought I was prepared. I had done plenty of hikes before, long day trips, and even a few overnight ones. I carried enough food, water, a small tent, a sleeping bag, a knife, a first aid kit, a flashlight, a headlamp, and spare batteries. I wore sturdy boots, layered clothes, and had a map folded in a waterproof case tucked into the top of my pack. I checked and rechecked everything the night before. I started the hike early in the morning, just after sunrise. The air was cool, damp from the night, and there was a light fog clinging to the tree line as I parked my car at the small gravel lot near the trailhead. There weren't any other cars there, which I noticed right away. I thought that was strange for a weekend morning in early fall, when most trails usually had at least a few cars scattered around by that time. I told myself that maybe I'd just gotten there earlier than most people. I tightened the straps of my pack and started up the trail. The first mile was a steady incline, gravel and packed dirt winding upward with tall pines standing on both sides. The forest was quiet, more quiet than usual, and I could hear every step of my boots on the ground, every crunch of gravel and snapping of twigs. Birds called in the distance, but it was faint and scattered. As I hiked higher, the fog lifted and the sunlight began to stream through the branches, breaking apart the shadows and making the green needles glisten with dew. The first few miles passed without trouble. I settled into a steady rhythm of walking, stopping every half hour or so to sip water and stretch. The forest grew denser the farther I went, the trees standing closer together, the light dimming slightly as the canopy thickened. Fallen branches and moss-covered logs lined the sides of the trail. Sometimes the ground sloped steeply off to one side, down into deep gullies filled with underbrush, and I had to watch my footing carefully. Around mile 5, I noticed something that gave me a small but sharp sense of unease. The trail, though marked on my map, wasn't as clear as I thought it would be. The dirt path narrowed and broke in places, covered by leaves and scattered rocks, and I had to look for faded markers painted on tree trunks to know I was going the right way. I didn't see any footprints or signs of recent hikers. It felt like the trail had been used less than I expected. Still, I pushed on. The air grew warmer as the day went on, and I peeled off my jacket and tied it to the back of my pack. Sweat dripped down my face as I climbed a steep, rocky incline that seemed to go on forever. By the time I reached the top, my legs were burning, but the view made it worth it. From the ridge, I could see miles of forest stretching in every direction, rolling hills fading into the hazy blue horizon. It was beautiful, but at the same time, I felt the weight of how alone I really was. I ate a quick lunch there, sitting on a flat rock and drinking deeply from my water bottle. As I chewed, I kept glancing back at the trail, half expecting to see someone else finally coming along. But the trail stayed empty, silent except for the rustling of leaves in the wind. I packed up and moved on, heading deeper into the forest. The trail sloped downward again, winding between tall oaks and maples whose branches swayed overhead. I kept walking, my mind wandering, but every so often I'd snap back into awareness with a jolt, realizing how isolated it felt. By afternoon, I'd gone at least 10 miles without seeing another person. That was when things began to turn uneasy. I first noticed it when I paused to rest against a tree. I took my pack off and sat in the dirt, leaning back and closing my eyes for just a moment. When I opened them again, I thought I saw movement down the trail I had just come from, a shadow slipping between the trees. I froze, my heart starting to thump hard. I stared at the trail for a long minute, but nothing came. No sound of footsteps, no figure, nothing. Just the same empty forest. I told myself it was my imagination. A bird flying, a branch swaying, anything like that. But the unease stuck with me. I stood up, shouldered my pack, and walked faster. As the hours passed, I began to feel it again. Like someone was back there, just out of sight. I would stop suddenly, trying to listen past the pounding of my own heartbeat, and sometimes I thought I heard a crunch of leaves that wasn't mine. But each time I turned, the trail was empty. I forced myself to keep going, telling myself I was being paranoid. The forest was quiet, yes, but that didn't mean I was being followed. I tried to shake it off. By late afternoon, the sun dipped lower, and I started thinking about where I would camp for the night. The trail map showed a flat area by a small stream about 2 miles ahead that was often used for camping. That became my goal. I picked up my pace, ignoring the ache in my legs and shoulders. When I reached the stream, I felt a brief wave of relief. The water trickled gently over smooth stones, and the ground nearby was level and soft with pine needles. I set down my pack and began setting up my tent, moving quickly as the light faded. My hands shook slightly, and I kept glancing at the trees as I worked, half expecting someone to be standing there, watching. Once the tent was up, I boiled some water on my small stove and made a quick dinner. I ate with my back against a log, facing the trail. The forest grew darker and darker until it was nothing but black shapes against the faint glow of the sky. I switched on my headlamp, its narrow beam cutting through the shadows, but it only made the darkness beyond feel thicker. When night fell completely, the fear came heavier. The forest was alive with small sounds, twigs snapping, leaves rustling, water trickling. But each sound seemed too close, too sharp. My nerves were stretched tight, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone out there. I crawled into my tent, zipped the door shut, and lay down in my sleeping bag. The nylon walls of the tent felt thin, almost useless, as if they couldn't possibly keep anything out. I lay there listening for what felt like hours, straining to catch any sound that didn't belong. Several times, I swore I heard footsteps circling just outside my tent, slow, careful, crunching on pine needles. My chest tightened, and I held my breath, gripping the handle of my knife inside the bag. But each time, the sound faded, and I was left wondering if I had only imagined it. Sleep came in restless, broken pieces. I woke often, jerking up at the faintest sound, heart racing. At one point in the dead of night, I thought I heard something brushing against the fabric of my tent. A dragging sound, faint but real. I froze completely, hardly breathing, every muscle stiff. It lasted a few seconds, then stopped. I didn't sleep again after that. When dawn finally came, I was already awake, eyes wide, exhausted. The forest outside was gray and silent. I unzipped the tent slowly and peeked out. Nothing was there. The ground around my campsite looked undisturbed. No footprints, no broken branches. I told myself again I was being paranoid, but the knot in my stomach didn't ease. I packed up quickly and started down the trail again. My body ached from poor sleep, and every sound in the forest made me twitch. The feeling of being followed never left me. Sometimes I even thought I saw shapes moving between the trees, far behind me, but they always disappeared when I looked closer. The day dragged on and the trail grew rougher. Steep switchbacks climbed along narrow ridges where one misstep could mean a fall into the ravine below. My legs trembled from fatigue, but I didn't want to stop. I just wanted to get back to the trailhead. By mid-afternoon, I still had at least 6 miles left. The sky grew cloudy, and the light dimmed, making the forest even darker. That was when I found something that made my blood run cold. A footprint, in the mud at the side of the trail. Fresh, clear, bigger than mine, pointing in the same direction I was going. Someone was ahead of me, or maybe had been standing there, waiting. I stared at it for a long time, my breathing shallow. The print was too crisp to be more than a day old, which meant whoever made it had been on this trail very recently. I don't know if it was fear or instinct, but I slowed down after that, moving as quietly as I could. Every nerve in my body screamed at me to turn around and run, but I forced myself to keep walking. The forest closed in tighter, the trail narrowing, the shadows lengthening. That last stretch was the longest, most terrifying part of my life. I felt eyes on me the entire time, just out of sight. Sometimes I thought I heard breathing behind me, soft and steady, matching my pace. Once, I swore I saw a figure up ahead on the trail. I had been planning the trip for weeks. It was supposed to be nothing more than a long hike through a stretch of national forest land, a way to clear my head from the constant noise of daily life. The route I chose was not the most popular one, but it was well marked on maps and seemed straightforward enough. I checked the forecast twice before I left, packed my bag with the essentials: water, food, first aid kit, flashlight, map, compass, extra layers, a small tarp, and my knife. I also carried a power bank for my phone, though I knew reception out there would be unreliable at best. I had done enough hiking in the past to know what I was getting into, or at least I thought I did. The morning I started was calm, cool, and almost too quiet. The air had that heavy smell of damp earth after a night of dew. My boots crunched on gravel and soil as I set off on the narrow trail, the trees closing in quickly once I left the parking area. At first, the path was wide and easy, the kind of trail that looks like it had been carved out years ago and used often. The morning light filtered through the trees, painting patches of brightness on the ground. It felt safe enough that I barely thought about the weight of the pack or the distance I needed to cover. I had planned for a simple out-and-back hike, about 15 miles total, something I thought I could finish in a day without pushing myself too hard. As I walked deeper, the forest began to change. The trees grew closer together, taller, and the light faded into a green dimness. Moss-covered stones and roots twisted up from the ground like ropes. The sound of birds was constant at first, but then started to fade until only the crunch of my boots filled the silence. I followed the trail markers nailed to the trees, always keeping one in sight so I wouldn't lose my way. After about 3 hours of steady hiking, I stopped to drink water and check my map. The trail curved uphill through a stretch of ridges before dropping down toward a small creek. That creek was supposed to be my halfway point. I figured I would eat lunch there before turning back. Everything still seemed fine, though I noticed the path was becoming less worn. Grass grew in the center of the trail, and fallen branches hadn't been cleared. It was clear that fewer people came this way, but it didn't bother me yet. I liked the solitude, and it was part of why I had chosen this trail in the first place. By the time I reached the top of one of the ridges, I was sweating heavily. The climb had been steeper than the map suggested. I stopped for another break, setting my pack against a tree and looking down over the slope. That was when I noticed the first thing that unsettled me. There was no sound, no birds, no insects, not even the rustling of leaves in the breeze. The forest was dead silent. I tried to shake it off, telling myself it was just one of those natural lulls, but it made me feel exposed. I moved on, trying to ignore the silence, but after another half mile I noticed something else. Some of the markers on the trees were missing. Where I expected to see a faded yellow blaze, there was nothing but rough bark. At first I thought I had missed one, but then I came across a tree where the marker had clearly been ripped off. The nails were still there, bent and rusted, but the paint was gone. It didn't make sense. The trail was on the official map, so it should have been maintained. The path became harder to follow after that. It narrowed, weaving between rocks and fallen logs, and I had to pay close attention to keep moving forward. I checked my compass several times, making sure I was still on the right bearing, but the deeper I went, the less confident I felt. The air grew cooler, and the light dimmed further. Clouds must have rolled in, though I couldn't see the sky through the thick canopy. Eventually, I reached the creek, though it didn't look the way I expected. On the map, it had been a thin blue line, something easy to cross. In reality, it was wider, faster, and filled with slick rocks. I stood on the bank for a long moment, weighing whether I should cross or not. The water wasn't deep, but it was enough to throw me off balance if I slipped. I almost turned around then, but I reminded myself this was my halfway point. If I could cross, eat, and rest for a while, the way back would feel easier. I made it across slowly, testing each rock before stepping onto it. My boots got wet, but I managed to keep from falling in. On the other side, I found a flat spot where I could sit and eat. The sandwich I pulled from my bag tasted bland, but I forced it down, washing it with lukewarm water. I tried to relax, to enjoy the quiet, but the silence pressed on me harder here. The air smelled damp, earthy, almost metallic. I noticed a strange shape carved into a tree near where I sat. It wasn't a blaze, not something from the trail maintainers. It looked more like someone had hacked crude lines into the bark. They formed no pattern I could understand, but the cuts were deep, fresh, and unnatural. A heavy unease settled over me. Something was off about this place. I packed up quickly and decided to turn back early, skipping the extra distance I had planned. The thought of being deeper in unsettled me too much. Crossing the creek again was harder this time. The rocks seemed slicker, the water louder. My foot slipped once, plunging into the cold current, and I almost lost my balance. My heart raced as I scrambled up the opposite bank, soaked and breathing hard. I told myself I just needed to focus and get back to the main stretch of trail. But when I climbed back up the ridge and started looking for the markers again, I couldn't find them. I retraced my steps, scanning the trees, but everything looked the same. The forest closed in around me, each direction blending into the next. I pulled out my compass and map, but the twisting ridges didn't match what was on paper. I realized then that I had no idea if I was on the right track. Panic started to build, slow and steady. I forced myself to keep moving, choosing what looked like the most worn path. I told myself it had to lead somewhere, maybe back toward the main trail. But after another hour of walking, I found myself circling back to the same creek from a different angle. The carved tree was there again, waiting for me. The sky had darkened by then, heavy with clouds, and the first drops of rain began to fall. My pack grew heavier as the water soaked in, and the trail turned slick under my boots. I tried another direction, climbing back up and away from the creek, but the woods became a maze. Fallen logs, thickets of underbrush, and steep drops forced me to change course again and again. My map was useless now. I shoved it back into my bag, relying only on the compass and instinct. Hours passed like that. I checked my phone once, but as expected, there was no signal. The battery was already draining faster than I liked, so I turned it off to save power. My legs burned, and my throat grew dry, but I kept moving, certain that if I stopped for too long, I would lose all sense of direction completely. By the time I admitted I was lost, it was nearly dark. The rain was steady now, soaking everything, dripping from my jacket, running cold down my neck. I found a small clearing and set up the tarp as best I could, tying it between two trees. It wasn't much shelter, but it kept the worst of the rain off. I ate a protein bar, sipped more water, and sat there shivering in the damp night. Every crack of a branch, every rustle of wet leaves made me jump. I knew animals lived in these woods, maybe bears or coyotes, and I felt exposed, weak, and very small. Sleep didn't come easy. I drifted in and out, waking at every sound. At one point, I swore I heard footsteps, slow and deliberate, moving just outside the reach of my light. I froze, gripping my knife, but the sound faded into the rain. Could have been water dripping, or it could have been something else. I would never know. When morning came, the rain had slowed but not stopped. I packed up quickly, determined to keep moving. My food supply was limited, enough for maybe another day if I stretched it. I knew I had to find my way out soon. I tried to orient myself with the compass, picking a direction and sticking to it. My plan was simple. Keep walking until I hit a road, a river, or some sign of human presence. The forest fought me every step of the way. The ground was uneven, the ridges steep, and my legs grew weaker with each mile. Blisters formed in my boots, making every step painful. The silence pressed in again, heavier than before. I felt like the trees were closing around me, trapping me in a place I didn't belong. Sometime in the afternoon, I stumbled across something that made my stomach drop. A fire pit, old and blackened, sat in a small clearing. Around it were the remains of camping gear, shredded fabric, rusted cans, broken poles. It looked abandoned for years, but there was something about it that felt wrong. The gear hadn't just rotted. It looked destroyed, torn apart violently. I didn't stay long. The unease in my chest grew too heavy. I kept walking until my legs shook with exhaustion. That night, I didn't even bother with the tarp. I crawled under a tree, wrapped my arms around myself, and tried to sleep in the mud. My mind played tricks on me, shapes in the darkness, whispers of movement in the distance. I told myself it was just fear, just the forest. I always liked hiking, but most of the trips I had done in the past were short trails near towns or parks where there were other people around. The trip I decided to take that summer was different. I wanted something harder, something more remote. I had read about a long loop trail that wound through forest, valleys, and mountainsides, far from busy roads. It wasn't the kind of place where families came for a picnic. It was a place where you could walk for miles without seeing anyone. That was the kind of trip I wanted, to test myself and feel the quiet of the wilderness. I drove to the trailhead on a hot morning. The air smelled of dry grass and dust from the road. I parked my car in a small gravel lot where only 2 other cars sat. I checked my backpack again before locking the doors. I had food for 2 days, a sleeping bag, a small tent, a water filter, extra clothes, a map, and a flashlight. The pack felt heavy when I lifted it, but I had trained with weights for weeks, so I told myself I could handle it. The first part of the trail was calm. It cut through tall trees with thick green leaves that blocked most of the sunlight. The ground was packed dirt, dry and firm under my boots. The sound of insects filled the air, a constant buzzing, mixed with the occasional distant bird call. I felt good as I walked, steady, full of energy. My legs stretched easily with every step. Sweat ran down my back, but I welcomed it. It felt like proof that I was working hard. For the first few hours, the trail climbed slowly uphill. Roots and rocks made the ground uneven. I stopped a few times to drink water and check the map. The trail markers were painted red on tree trunks, easy to follow. I remember thinking how simple it seemed, just 1 foot after another, no confusion. After noon, the forest began to thin out. The trail rose toward a ridge where the trees grew shorter, more spaced apart. The sun beat down harder here. My shirt clung to my skin, and every sip of water felt like it vanished too quickly. I told myself to ration it until I could reach the small stream marked on the map ahead. When I reached the ridge, I stood for a while looking at the view. Hills rolled out into the distance, covered in forests, with a few rocky cliffs breaking through the green. The wind blew across the ridge, carrying a dry smell of pine and earth. I pulled out a snack bar and ate slowly while I scanned the valleys below. Nothing moved. No houses, no cars, no trails of smoke. It was just me, alone in the middle of a wide stretch of land. I thought about how small I looked compared to everything else. That feeling stayed with me as I began the long descent on the other side. The downhill section was harder than I expected. The dirt was loose, and my boots slipped often. My knees ached from the constant pressure. I tried to keep my balance by holding onto branches, but several times I slid a few feet before catching myself. My heart pounded after each slip, but I pushed forward, telling myself it would level out soon. By late afternoon, I reached the bottom of the valley. The air was cooler here, but thick with humidity. Mosquitoes swarmed around my face and arms. I sprayed repellent, but they still circled close, their high whine digging into my ears. My shirt was damp, sticking to my chest and stomach. I could smell the sourness of my own sweat. The map showed a stream nearby, so I searched until I heard running water. I followed the sound and found a clear stream cutting through rocks and moss. I knelt and filled my bottle, filtering the water carefully. The cold liquid washed down my throat, refreshing me after hours of thirst. I splashed some on my face, rubbing away the sweat and dirt. As I stood by the stream, I noticed how quiet it was. The forest around me seemed too still. No birds called. The only sound was the rush of water. I felt a sudden wave of unease, though I couldn't explain why. The stillness pressed against my ears. I quickly packed up and returned to the trail, moving faster than before. The sun dipped lower behind the ridge. Shadows stretched across the forest floor, long and uneven. I checked my watch. It was time to find a place to set up camp. I wanted to rest before it grew too dark. I left the main trail and searched for flat ground. I found a small clearing surrounded by young pines. The soil was soft and covered in needles. It looked like a decent spot. I set down my pack and started to pitch the tent. My fingers shook slightly as I worked with the poles, though the air was warm. I thought it was just fatigue. When the tent was up, I laid out my sleeping bag and sat outside to cook a meal. I boiled water on a small stove and poured it into a pouch of dried food. The smell of hot pasta rose into the air. I ate slowly, chewing each bite until it felt like paste. My stomach tightened, not from hunger but from tension I couldn't shake. The forest grew darker. The sounds returned: crickets, frogs, distant rustling. But the uneasy feeling didn't leave me. Every movement in the trees made me glance up sharply. I tried to tell myself it was just animals, but my shoulders stayed stiff and my breath shallow. When night came, I crawled into the tent and zipped it closed. The thin walls of fabric felt flimsy, like they couldn't protect me from anything. I lay on my back, staring at the nylon ceiling. My flashlight cast a small circle of light that made the shadows outside seem even darker. I tried to sleep, but every noise woke me. Branches cracked, leaves rustled, insects buzzed. Once I heard something heavy move through the underbrush not far from my tent. My chest tightened. I held my breath, straining to hear. The sound faded, but my heart kept pounding. I lay there, frozen, until exhaustion finally pulled me into shallow sleep. I woke at dawn. My throat was dry, and my body ached from the hard ground. I stepped out of the tent and stretched, scanning the clearing. Nothing looked disturbed, though I still felt watched. I packed quickly and got back on the trail. The second day was harder. The trail grew steeper, twisting up a rocky hillside. My legs burned, and sweat poured down my face. My pack felt heavier than before, pressing into my shoulders. I stopped more often, each break lasting longer than I wanted. The air was hot and still, with no breeze to cool me. By midday, I reached a narrow ledge that clung to the side of a cliff. The path was no wider than 2 feet, with a sheer drop on one side. My stomach churned as I inched along, hugging the rock wall. Pebbles slid down into the abyss with each step. My palms grew slick with sweat, and I had to wipe them on my pants before gripping the rock again. When I finally crossed the ledge, my legs trembled. I collapsed onto the ground and sat for a long time, staring at the dirt, too drained to move. Fear had worn me down more than the climb. The map said the trail would loop back toward the ridge soon, bringing me closer to the trailhead. I forced myself up, pushing forward, but the trail markers became harder to find. The red paint on the trees was faded, chipped away by weather. I wandered off track more than once, circling until I found the right path again. Each mistake cost me time and energy. By late afternoon, clouds gathered overhead. The sky darkened, and thunder rolled in the distance. I quickened my pace, hoping to find shelter before the storm broke. The air grew heavy, pressing against my skin. Then the rain came, sheets of water that soaked me instantly. The trail turned to mud, sucking at my boots. Lightning flashed above the ridge, followed by sharp cracks of thunder that echoed through the valley. I stumbled forward, blinded by water running into my eyes. The mud made each step a fight. My pack pulled me down, and several times I nearly fell face first into the muck. My breathing turned ragged, my chest tight with panic. Finally, I saw a small rock overhang ahead. I ducked beneath it, pressing my back against the cool stone. Water cascaded over the edge like a curtain. I shivered, even though the air was warm. My clothes clung to me, heavy and cold. The storm lasted for over an hour. I sat there, hugging my knees, waiting for it to pass. When the rain finally slowed, the forest looked transformed. Everything dripped and glistened. Mist curled up from the ground, clinging to the trees. The trail was nearly invisible under the mud and water. I pushed forward again, but the trail was harder to follow now. Some markers were washed clean. The ground was torn by small streams of runoff. I checked the map often, but the shapes of the land no longer matched perfectly. As the sky dimmed, I realized I was lost. Panic rose sharp in my chest. I spun in circles, scanning for signs of the trail, but every direction looked the same. The trees pressed close, their wet bark shining. I tried to calm myself, to think clearly. I still had food, water, and gear. I could survive the night and find the trail again in daylight. I chose a patch of ground between two trees and set up the tent, though the soil was soft and wet. My hands shook as I drove the stakes into the ground. The forest around me seemed alive with noises, drips, cracks. It was late summer when I decided to take a long hiking trip by myself. I had been planning it for weeks, checking the maps, reading about the terrain, and going through my gear again and again. I wanted to push myself further than I normally did. Most of my hikes before this were short ones, maybe a day trip or an overnight stay somewhere close to the road. This time I wanted something longer, something that would keep me out for several days in an area that was more remote. I picked a stretch of mountain trail that I had only read about online. The reviews said it was challenging, that parts of it were narrow and steep, and that once you got deep in there you wouldn't see anyone for hours, maybe even a whole day. That kind of solitude was exactly what I wanted, at least when I was still sitting at home planning it out. I remember the morning I left. My backpack felt heavier than it should have, even though I had carefully chosen what to bring. I carried a tent, sleeping bag, small stove, food for 4 days, 2 bottles for water, a filter pump, an emergency kit, extra clothes, and a knife. I thought about taking bear spray too, but I had never actually seen a bear on my past hikes, so I left it behind. That was my first mistake. At the time, it didn't feel like a mistake. It just felt like I was keeping my pack lighter. The first few hours of the hike felt good. The air was warm but not hot. The sky was clear, and the trail was easy to follow. It started through thick forest, where the ground was soft with pine needles and the smell of sap was strong. Every so often I could hear birds or the sound of a small animal moving through the brush. My steps crunched in a steady rhythm, and I felt relaxed, like I had made the right choice to get away from everything. The first few miles went by quickly. I stopped once to drink water and eat a granola bar, then kept moving. By midday, the trail began to climb higher. The forest thinned out a little, giving me glimpses of the ridges ahead. The path was narrower here, with loose rocks underfoot that made me careful about where I stepped. My pack felt heavier now, sweat soaking through the straps on my shoulders. I kept telling myself that the effort was worth it, that the views at the top would make me forget about the weight and the ache in my legs. Around that time, I noticed how quiet it was. The deeper I got, the less sound there seemed to be. No cars, no human voices, not even the sound of wind through the trees. Just the steady beat of my own footsteps. I set up camp that first night on a flat patch of ground near a small creek. It was the perfect spot, with water close by and enough space to pitch my tent. After filtering water and making a quick meal on my stove, I sat there listening to the faint gurgle of the creek. The air cooled fast once the sun dropped, and I pulled on a jacket while I ate. Darkness in the woods always feels different than darkness in town. It's heavier, thicker, and when it comes it feels like the world has been cut off. My small lantern lit up just a circle around me, the rest swallowed in blackness. I tried not to think too much about what might be out there. I crawled into my tent and forced myself to sleep, though I woke several times in the night to small noises. Each time I told myself it was just branches snapping or animals moving around. Nothing unusual. The next day, I continued higher into the mountains. The trail twisted and climbed, and I had to stop more often to catch my breath. At times, it felt like I was climbing stairs that never ended. The views were incredible, though. Sharp ridges lined against a pale blue sky, deep valleys stretching below. I felt small but alive, the kind of feeling that makes you think you can handle anything. That feeling didn't last long. Late in the afternoon, clouds began to gather. I hadn't checked the forecast as carefully as I should have. Another mistake. The air grew cooler, and the first drops of rain fell just as I found another place to camp, this time higher up, more exposed. I rushed to set up the tent, fumbling with the poles while the rain picked up. By the time I got everything inside, I was wet and shivering. The storm lasted for hours. Rain hammered against the tent fabric, and wind pushed at the sides until it felt like the whole thing would tear away. I lay there in the dark, my sleeping bag pulled tight, waiting for it to end. When it finally did, the silence felt worse. It was too quiet, like the world outside had emptied out completely. The third day was when things really started to go wrong. I left camp early, hoping to make good distance before the next storm. The trail was slick with mud, and I had to use my hands to steady myself on the rocks. A couple of times I slipped and caught myself just in time. My knees and palms were scraped, but I kept moving. Around mid-morning, I noticed something strange. I saw footprints on the trail ahead. At first, I thought they were mine from the day before, but the direction was wrong. These were coming toward me, not going away. The prints were larger than my boots, and deep in the mud. I froze when I realized what they meant. Someone else was out there, someone bigger than me, maybe heavier, and not too far ahead. I stood there for a long time, my heart beating fast, trying to decide if I should keep going. Finally, I convinced myself it was nothing. Maybe another hiker had passed through. Maybe I just hadn't noticed before. I moved on, but from that point I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. That night, I made camp in a small clearing surrounded by thick brush. I chose it because it felt hidden, like no one would stumble across it by accident. Still, I couldn't relax. Every sound made me tense up. At one point, just after I had put out my stove, I heard branches cracking nearby. Not the light snaps of small animals, but heavier steps, slow and steady. I held my breath, gripping the handle of my knife even though I knew it wouldn't do much if someone or something really came into camp. The sound faded after a while, but I couldn't sleep. I lay awake listening, straining to hear anything else. Sometime in the night, I must have dozed off, because I woke with a start to the faint sound of something brushing against the outside of the tent. My whole body froze. I wanted to unzip the flap and look, but fear pinned me in place. I stayed still until the sound was gone, though it felt like hours. The next morning, I packed up fast and hit the trail. My stomach was tight and I barely ate. I kept looking over my shoulder, half expecting to see someone behind me. The forest felt darker that day, even though the sun was out. I followed the path higher until it leveled off along a narrow ridge. On one side, the slope dropped away sharply into trees. On the other side, it rose into jagged rocks. There wasn't much room to move, just a thin track with loose gravel. I forced myself forward, step by step, not daring to look down. Halfway across, I heard it again. A sound behind me, slow steps crunching on gravel. I spun around, but the trail was empty. Nothing but the empty path stretching back into the trees. My mouth was dry, my hands shaking. I hurried forward, nearly slipping in my rush to get across. That night was the worst. I found a flat patch near some boulders and set up my tent quickly. I ate cold food straight from the bag because I didn't want to light the stove. As soon as it was dark, the sounds started again. At first, just the occasional snap of a branch. Then later, the sound of steps circling the campsite. Not rushing, not careless, but slow and deliberate, as if someone was testing how close they could get. I stayed perfectly still inside the tent, every muscle tense. My knife was in my hand the whole time. I didn't sleep at all. I just lay there, waiting, listening to the sound of something or someone moving around me in the dark. At one point, I thought I saw a shadow against the fabric of the tent, tall and still. My throat was so tight I couldn't even swallow. Eventually, the steps faded, and I was left in silence. But I knew then that I couldn't stay out there another night. I had to get out. At first light, I tore down the tent and stuffed everything into my pack. I didn't care how messy it was. I just needed to move. I headed back the way I came, moving as fast as I could without slipping. The trail felt longer now, the forest heavier. Every sound made me jump. I kept looking behind me, sure I would see someone there, following. Hours passed, my legs aching, but I didn't stop. Not until I finally reached the lower section of the trail where the forest opened up and I could hear the faint sound of a road in the distance. Relief hit me hard, but I didn't slow down. I walked until I saw the small parking lot where I had left my car days before. Only then did I allow myself to breathe. When I finally reached the car, I threw my pack inside and sat there gripping the steering wheel, shaking. I looked back at the trail, half expecting to see someone emerge from the trees. No one did. The lot was empty except for me. I started the engine and drove away, not looking back again. Even now, thinking about it, I don't know if it was a person following me or if it was just my imagination fueled by fear and isolation. But I know what I heard, and I know the feeling that stayed with me the entire way out. I had wanted solitude, but what I found was something else entirely. I still hike, but I've never gone back to that trail, and I never will. It started as a plan to spend 2 days hiking a remote stretch of trail that cut through thick forest, rocky ridges, and a long valley that was supposed to have little human traffic. I had been trying to challenge myself with longer solo trips, and this one felt like it would be manageable. I had studied the maps, checked the distance, and packed carefully. I wanted to push myself without doing anything reckless. At least that was how it seemed in the beginning. The trail was known for being long and narrow in certain parts, with sections where the trees grew so close together that little sunlight broke through. I was drawn to the idea of being completely away from noise, people, and roads. I pictured quiet mornings and still evenings. What I didn't picture was how quickly the silence could turn heavy and unsettling when the sun dipped behind the ridges and the woods swallowed the light. I parked my car at a small pull-off just before noon. The air was warm but carried that crisp bite of autumn. I locked the doors, threw my pack over my shoulders, and started walking. At first, everything matched what I had expected. The path was clear, the ground soft with layers of pine needles, and the trees swayed gently above me. I moved at a steady pace, listening to the crunch of my boots and the occasional bird call. After about 2 hours, I reached a fork where the official trail bent east, but a narrower side path stretched toward the valley I wanted to see. I had checked the maps. This side route connected back to the main loop, but it was less maintained. That appealed to me. I wanted the feeling of being out where most people wouldn't bother to go. The further I went, the quieter it became. The breeze seemed to drop, and even the birds were less frequent. I only heard my own movements and the occasional snap of a twig underfoot. The trail narrowed until it felt more like a game path than anything designed for hikers. Branches scratched against my jacket, and I had to push through thickets that had clearly gone untouched for years. I kept moving, telling myself this was exactly the type of quiet hike I had wanted. I stopped briefly at a small creek, filled my water bottle using the filter, and kept walking. The forest thickened on both sides, and I started to notice how difficult it would be to cut off trail if I needed to. Fallen trees, tangles of brush, and uneven ground made the woods feel like walls closing in. The narrow path was the only clear line ahead. As I pressed deeper, I saw less sign of animals. The ground was littered with dry leaves, but no fresh prints. I thought about how remote it must be, how few people probably came this way. That was when I first felt a small flicker of unease. Not fear, just the realization of how alone I truly was. If I twisted an ankle or lost my pack, nobody would be walking by. Nobody would hear me. By late afternoon, I found a flat spot beside a small rise and decided to set up camp for the night. The spot wasn't perfect, but it was large enough for my small tent, and I didn't want to risk moving further and being caught without a place to stop before dark. I cleared away sticks, pitched the tent, and boiled some water for food. As I sat there eating, I noticed how quickly the forest swallowed sound. Even when I shifted on my camp pad, the noise seemed muffled. The air was completely still, and the longer I sat, the more I realized how deep the silence was. No crickets, no distant rustle of deer, just absolute stillness. I tried to brush it off, telling myself maybe this stretch of forest simply wasn't active in the evenings. But as the darkness deepened, that silence started to crawl under my skin. It was too complete. When I finally climbed into the tent and turned off my headlamp, the blackness pressed down on me. I lay there listening, straining for any natural sound, but the woods gave me nothing. Sometime after midnight, I woke to a noise. It wasn't loud, but after hours of pure silence, even the smallest sound snapped me awake. It was the crunch of leaves underfoot, slow and uneven, like someone or something walking nearby. My body went cold instantly. I froze, holding my breath, listening as hard as I could. The steps were faint but real. They weren't scurrying, not the quick dart of an animal. They were deliberate, steady, one after the other, moving across the forest floor. They came from upslope, somewhere beyond the rise I had camped beside. I waited, every muscle tense, my heart hammering so loud I was sure it would give me away. The steps grew closer, then stopped. The silence returned, but now it was heavy with the knowledge that something, or someone, was out there. I stayed frozen in my sleeping bag, eyes wide in the pitch black, straining for even the smallest hint of movement. Minutes crawled by. Nothing. Just that suffocating silence again. Eventually, I told myself it must have been an animal. A deer, maybe. Something small moving through leaves. But deep down, I knew the rhythm of those steps hadn't matched an animal. I didn't sleep again that night. I lay awake until the first hint of dawn filtered through the trees. As soon as the light was enough to see, I packed up camp and got moving. I felt uneasy, but I didn't want to panic myself. The smart thing was to keep moving, finish the loop, and get back to my car. The trail grew rougher as I descended into the valley. Thick brush, fallen logs, and uneven ground forced me to slow down. I felt exposed. Every snap of a branch or shift of leaves made me whip my head around. But each time there was nothing, just trees. By mid-morning, I found myself in a stretch where the trail all but disappeared. The map showed it passing through, but the ground was so overgrown I had to search for any sign of where to go. I pushed through chest-high brush, sweat soaking my back despite the cool air. Every time I stopped to check the map, I caught myself listening. The silence hadn't gone away. Then I heard it again. A faint crunch somewhere behind me. My blood ran cold. I spun, staring into the wall of brush. Nothing moved. Nothing showed itself. I stood there, gripping my trekking pole so hard my hand shook. I forced myself forward, heart racing. I walked faster than before, stumbling over roots, scraping my shins on hidden branches. Every few minutes, I thought I heard it again, just faint steps in the brush behind me. Never close, but never gone. Always the same slow rhythm. The valley narrowed into a long stretch where steep slopes rose on both sides. The trees thinned just enough to let light through, but the trail itself was little more than an uneven track beside a shallow creek. This was where I started to feel truly trapped. The slopes were too steep to climb, the brush too thick to cut through. The only way was forward, and whatever was behind me seemed to know that. I couldn't shake the sense that I was being followed. It wasn't just in my head. I felt it in my gut, that primal instinct that something unseen was keeping pace. Every time I stopped, I swore the steps stopped too. Every time I pushed forward, I thought I heard them resume. Hours dragged on. My legs burned from the pace I forced myself to keep. My throat was dry from shallow, panicked breaths. I barely stopped to drink or eat. I just kept moving. The map said if I stayed on course, the valley would open back up and connect to the main loop. That thought was the only thing that kept me going. By late afternoon, my nerves were shot. I stumbled constantly, tripping on rocks, snapping branches underfoot. Each noise I made sounded deafening in the silent woods. I imagined eyes watching me from every shadow, imagined a figure just out of sight. Finally, after what felt like forever, I saw the terrain change. The valley widened, the trail became more distinct, and the trees opened enough to show a stretch of ridgeline in the distance. Relief flooded me, but only for a moment, because that was when I heard it. Not faint, not distant, clear and close. The crunch of a footstep directly behind me, no more than a few yards away. I spun, heart hammering, but the path behind me was empty. My chest heaved as I scanned the brush, every nerve on fire. There was nothing, just still trees, motionless leaves. But the sound had been right there. I didn't think. I just ran. My pack slammed against my back, my boots pounded the dirt, and I pushed myself harder than I ever had. I ran until my lungs felt like they would tear, until my vision blurred from the effort. I didn't stop, didn't dare look behind me. When I finally broke onto the main loop trail, I nearly collapsed. I bent over, gasping, sweat dripping off my face. The forest around me was brighter here, more open. Birds even called faintly from the trees, the first real sound I had heard in nearly a day. It felt like stepping out of a nightmare, but I didn't stop. I forced myself onward, pushing down the trail as fast as my legs would carry me. Every time I thought about slowing, I remembered that single clear footstep, and adrenaline surged through me again. By the time I reached the pull-off where my car waited, the sun was dipping low. My legs shook. My hands trembled so badly I fumbled with the keys. I yanked the door open, threw my pack inside, and locked the doors the instant I was in. I had been planning it for weeks, scrolling through maps, reading trail reviews, and checking weather forecasts every day. The route was not considered difficult, just a long loop through a mountain ridge that was popular in summer but quieter in early fall. I liked hiking alone because it gave me time to think, and I felt confident enough in my skills. I had done many day hikes before and even some weekend backpacking trips. I thought I had enough experience to handle anything that might happen. I drove out early that morning. The sun was just beginning to rise, painting the sky a dull orange. The parking lot at the trailhead was nearly empty, only one other car parked at the far end. I checked my backpack one last time before locking the car. I had water, snacks, a map, compass, flashlight, and a light jacket. My phone was fully charged, though I knew service would be spotty deep in the mountains. I felt prepared. The first part of the trail was calm and pleasant. It wound through thick forest, pine needles soft under my boots, air cool and damp with the smell of wet soil. Birds moved between the branches above me, and I could hear the sound of a stream running somewhere close by. I walked at a steady pace, enjoying the quiet. My breathing was easy, and my body felt strong. Hours passed as the trail climbed higher. The forest thinned out into rocky slopes, the ground uneven with loose stones. The air was cooler here, sharper against my skin, but the view opened wide. I could see distant peaks and valleys stretching out below me, sunlight shifting through patches of cloud. It was beautiful, the kind of beauty that makes you forget about time. I checked my map and saw that I was making good progress. The loop I had chosen was long, around 15 miles, but I had started early and planned to be back before dark. The highest part of the ridge was still ahead, but I felt good. I stopped to drink some water, stretched my legs, and kept going. The trail grew steeper as I climbed. The forest disappeared almost completely, replaced by scrubby bushes and jagged rock. The path twisted sharply along the side of the ridge, at times narrow enough that I felt nervous looking down. One slip would have sent me tumbling a long way. My legs burned, sweat dripped down my neck, but I kept pushing. When I finally reached the top, I felt a rush of relief. The view was incredible, mountains rolling endlessly, valleys cut deep below, the sky pale and endless above. The wind was stronger up here, carrying the cold bite of altitude. I ate a snack, drank more water, and sat down to rest. My legs trembled slightly from the effort, but I felt proud. That was when I made the mistake. The trail markers at the top were faint, weather-worn and difficult to see. There were multiple paths branching off the ridge, some used by climbers, others by animals. I pulled out my map, trying to match what I saw in front of me to the lines and curves printed on the paper. I thought I had it right. I folded the map, adjusted my pack, and started down what I believed was the correct way. The path at first looked fine, though rougher than the one I had been on earlier. It twisted downward, narrow and rocky, but it felt like it was leading in the right direction. I told myself it would meet up with the main trail again lower down. I moved carefully, using my hands to steady myself against the rock, sliding in some places where the ground was too steep. But after half an hour, doubt began to creep in. The path grew less clear, broken in places by loose rock and thick brush. I stopped, checked my map again, tried to orient myself. I couldn't see any familiar landmarks. The mountains all looked the same from here, gray and green slopes stretching endlessly in every direction. My compass needle shook in the wind, but I wasn't sure if I was matching it correctly with the map. I kept moving downward, thinking I would eventually meet the main trail. But the slope grew sharper, and soon I found myself scrambling over rocks instead of walking a clear path. My breathing grew harder, my legs tired quickly, and unease sat heavy in my chest. The sun was dipping lower, shadows beginning to stretch across the ridges. That was when I realized I wasn't on any trail at all. The ground beneath me was rough, sharp stones and sliding dirt. Every step felt unstable. I looked back up, thinking about climbing back the way I came, but the slope looked impossible from this angle. I felt trapped, caught between going back and going forward. My heart began to pound. I decided to keep moving downward. I thought if I could reach the tree line again, I might find a clearer path or at least safer ground. The forest below looked dark but inviting compared to the exposed ridge. I picked my way down slowly, gripping rocks and branches, my boots slipping on gravel. By the time I reached the trees, the sun was nearly gone. The forest was darker than I expected, shadows swallowing everything. My flashlight came out, its thin beam shaking in my hand as I moved forward. I tried to stay calm, telling myself I would find the trail again soon. But the forest was endless. The ground was uneven, full of roots and rocks that caught my feet. Branches scraped against my arms and face. Every few minutes, I stopped to listen, straining to hear running water or the faint echo of the trail. But there was nothing, just silence broken by the occasional snap of a twig somewhere in the dark. Fear set in deeper. I thought about the warnings I had read online, stories of people who had gotten lost in these mountains. Some were found after days, weak and dehydrated. Others were never found at all. My mouth went dry, my chest tight. I forced myself to keep moving, even when every instinct screamed at me to stop. Hours passed like that. My flashlight beam cut across endless trees, the ground rising and falling unpredictably. I stumbled more than once, catching myself on roots, my hands raw from grabbing rough bark. My water bottle grew lighter, my food nearly gone. I began to feel dizzy, my legs heavy as stone. Eventually, exhaustion forced me to stop. I found a flat spot against the base of a tree and sat down, breathing hard. The night was cold, colder than I had expected, and I pulled my jacket tighter around me. My flashlight flickered, the battery nearly dead. I shut it off to save what little was left, plunging myself into total darkness. The sounds of the forest pressed in. Rustling leaves, distant cracking branches, the low moan of wind through the trees. Every sound made my muscles tense. I tried to rest, closing my eyes, but sleep never came. Fear kept me awake, along with the biting cold that sank deeper into my body as the night dragged on. When the first light of dawn came, it felt like a lifeline. Pale gray filtered through the trees, slowly chasing away the shadows. My body ached, my throat dry, but I forced myself to stand and start moving again. I had no idea where I was, but I couldn't stay there. The second day was worse. My water was gone by mid-morning, my lips cracked and dry. My legs trembled with every step. The forest seemed endless, stretching in all directions with no sign of a trail. I tried climbing a hill to get a better view, but all I saw was more forest, more ridges fading into the distance. Desperation set in. I shouted, though I knew there was little chance anyone would hear. My voice echoed weakly, swallowed by the trees. I thought about my car sitting miles away in the trailhead lot, about the empty space in the parking lot where no one would even notice I hadn't come back yet. I kept moving, stumbling downhill whenever I could, hoping I would find water. My tongue felt swollen, my head light. Hours later, I heard the faint trickle of a stream. Relief flooded me as I followed the sound, and when I finally saw the thin line of water running between rocks, I dropped to my knees and drank greedily. It was cold and clean, the best water I had ever tasted. But even with water, the fear never left. I still had no idea where I was or how to get back. My body screamed for rest, but I knew I couldn't stop too long. I moved along the stream, thinking it might lead me somewhere, but it twisted endlessly through the forest, sometimes disappearing underground before reappearing again. The second night was worse than the first. The cold was sharper, my body weaker. I barely slept, shivering and shaking under my thin jacket. My stomach ached with hunger, but I had no food left. Every sound in the dark set my nerves on edge, but I couldn't move anymore. I sat with my back against a tree, waiting for the night to end. By the third day, I felt broken. My legs barely carried me, my vision blurred. I followed the stream still, dragging myself forward, my thoughts hazy and slow. I wondered how long I could last like this. I wondered if anyone was even looking for me. Then, late that afternoon, I saw it. The faint line of a trail cutting across the stream ahead. My heart nearly stopped. It was narrow, overgrown, but it was a trail. I stumbled onto it, hardly believing it was real. I followed it uphill, and after an hour, I had been planning the hike for weeks, maybe even months if I was being honest. It wasn't supposed to be anything too extreme, just a challenging trail in the mountains a few hours from home. I had read about it online and on a few hiking forums. People described it as a trail that wasn't exactly easy, but still manageable for someone with decent experience. I had done a handful of long hikes before, some with friends, some alone, and this time I wanted to test myself on something harder. I thought of it as a way to reset my head, spend a couple of days in nature, and prove to myself that I could handle it. The trail followed a river that ran deep into the mountains. At first, the land was gentle and open, the path cutting through fields and forest, the water always close enough that I could hear it rushing over the rocks. The morning air was cool when I started, but I knew it would get warmer as the day went on. My backpack sat heavy on my shoulders, the straps biting into me, but I had packed carefully. Food, water, tent, sleeping bag, first aid kit, a small stove, flashlight, spare batteries, rain gear, and even a whistle in case of trouble. I thought I had done everything right. For the first several miles, everything went smoothly. The ground was damp from the rain the night before, and my boots squelched in the mud, but I didn't mind. Birds flitted between the trees, their songs echoing in the valley. I saw no one else that morning, which gave me a strange mix of excitement and unease. I liked the idea of having the trail to myself, but there was also a part of me that felt exposed, like maybe I shouldn't be so far from anyone else. Still, I pushed that feeling aside. I was there to hike, to be alone, to test myself. The terrain grew steeper as the trail wound deeper into the mountains. The river narrowed into a gorge, the sound of the water louder and more violent now, crashing against sharp rocks. The path itself became rougher too, full of loose stones and roots that forced me to watch each step. I felt my legs burning as I climbed, my pack dragging at my shoulders, but I reminded myself this was what I wanted. The sweat, the strain, the effort. It was the point of being out there. By the afternoon, the weather shifted. Clouds slid across the sky, blocking out the sun, and the air grew cooler. A breeze picked up, whispering through the trees. I pulled my jacket tighter and quickened my pace, knowing I still had several miles to go before the spot where I had planned to set up camp. That was when I noticed how narrow the trail had become. On one side, the ground rose into jagged rock faces. On the other, it dropped sharply down toward the river, which churned and roared far below. The dirt path was barely wide enough for me to stand comfortably, and in places it crumbled at the edge, falling away into loose gravel. I slowed down, planting each boot carefully, my heart beating a little harder than before. I told myself it was fine. I had good boots, good balance, and no reason to slip. But the thought kept pushing at the back of my mind. One wrong step and I would fall, and if I fell here, no one would even know where I had gone. As I moved along the narrow stretch, I tried not to look down, but the sound of the river below made it impossible to forget it was there. My breathing grew heavier, more forced, and my fingers brushed the stone wall beside me for balance. I moved slowly, too slowly, and I hated that I could feel fear creeping into my chest. When I finally reached a wider section, I stopped and let myself breathe. My legs were trembling from the tension, my shoulders aching under the weight of the pack. I sat down on a flat rock and sipped from my water bottle, trying to calm myself. The silence out there was heavy. Only the river and the wind filled the air, and even though I knew that was normal, it made me feel small, isolated, like the mountains were swallowing me whole. I thought about turning back. The idea slipped into my head like a warning, but I pushed it away. I was halfway there, and if I turned back now, it would feel like failure. I wanted to finish this trail, to camp where I had planned, and wake up in the wilderness like I had imagined. So I stood, slung the pack over my shoulders again, and kept walking. The sky grew darker as the afternoon slipped into evening. The clouds were thick now, and the air smelled like rain. I checked my watch, calculating how much longer it would take to reach the campsite I had marked on my map. Maybe an hour, maybe more if the trail kept being difficult. I told myself I could do it, that I just had to focus on moving one step at a time. The trail climbed higher, twisting through sharp switchbacks. The ground was damp and slick in places, and I had to grab roots or rocks to keep steady. My hands grew dirty, my knees sore from the strain of climbing. At one point, I slipped on wet stone and went down hard, my knees slamming into the ground. Pain flared, and for a moment I thought I had torn something. I sat there, breathing through the sting, feeling the throb spread through my leg. When I tested it, it held, though it hurt to put weight on it. That was the first time I really felt the danger of being alone. If I had broken my leg, what would I have done? No one knew exactly where I was. My phone had no service. I was just a speck in the middle of a huge mountain range, and no one would be coming. I pushed myself up and kept moving, slower now, careful not to stumble again. My knee ached with every step, but I didn't want to stop, not when the sky above me was growing darker by the minute. When I finally reached the small clearing I had chosen as a campsite, the relief hit me hard. The ground was level, with enough space for my tent, and trees surrounded it on three sides, blocking some of the wind. The river was still close enough that I could hear it, though now it was just background noise, less threatening than before. I dropped my pack and set to work quickly, pulling out my tent and stakes, my fingers stiff with cold. The wind tugged at the fabric as I struggled to get it upright, but eventually I had it standing, my little shelter against the wild. I crawled inside and laid out my sleeping bag, the sight of it making me feel like I had carved out a small safe space in the vast emptiness around me. After a quick meal from one of the dehydrated packs I had brought, I sat in the tent entrance, watching the sky shift from gray to near black. The forest grew darker with it, shadows thickening between the trees. I listened to the wind, the creak of branches, the occasional crack of something shifting in the woods. Every sound made my skin crawl, but I told myself it was just nature doing what it always did. When full night came, I zipped the tent closed and lay down, the thin fabric walls flapping slightly in the wind. My body was exhausted, every muscle aching, but my mind wouldn't quiet. I kept imagining what would happen if someone or something moved through the forest. I thought about animals, about how I hadn't seen any so far, and wondered if that was luck or if they were simply avoiding me. I thought about how easy it would be for someone to follow the same trail I had taken, to come across my tent in the dark, and I would never hear them until they were right outside. The fear was irrational, I knew that, but alone in the woods, everything feels different. The tent was thin, fragile, barely a barrier. My flashlight lay beside me, but I didn't want to turn it on. Didn't want to shine light into the dark and see what might reflect back. Sleep came in small, broken pieces. I woke again and again to the sound of the wind, to the scrape of branches, to the sudden crack of something heavy falling somewhere in the distance. Each time, my heart raced and I lay frozen, straining to hear if it was coming closer. At some point, rain began to fall, soft at first, then heavier, drumming on the fabric of the tent. Water beaded and ran down the sides, and I curled deeper into my sleeping bag, trying to convince myself it was soothing. It wasn't. The sound only made the night feel thicker, heavier, as though the forest had closed itself around me. When morning finally came, pale and gray, I felt like I hadn't slept at all. My body was stiff, my head pounding from tension. I crawled out of the tent into the damp air, the forest wet and dripping around me. Mist clung to the ground, making the trees look like tall, shadowy figures standing guard. I boiled water for coffee, forcing myself to eat a small breakfast even though my stomach was tight. Then I packed up quickly, eager to get moving again. The trail ahead climbed higher into the mountains, and I knew I still had many miles to go before it would loop back down toward civilization. But the rain had made everything worse. The ground was slick, mud pulling at my boots, rocks shining with wetness. My knees screamed each time I stepped wrong, and I found myself moving slower than I wanted. The forest was silent except for the drip of water, and every time I looked over my shoulder, I half expected to see someone standing there. The trail led me to another narrow section, worse than the one before. This time, the drop beside me was even steeper, the river even farther down, roaring white and violent. My boots slid on the wet stone, and I pressed myself against the rock wall, inching along with my heart slamming in my chest. The mist made everything slick and hard to see, and for one horrible moment, I felt my foot skid out from under me. My hand shot out. I had planned this trip for months. The idea of spending several days hiking through the forest alone had been circling in my mind since winter. By the time spring rolled around, I convinced myself I was ready for it. I wanted the challenge of carrying my own gear, following a long trail deep into the hills, and testing how well I could handle being completely on my own. I was 31 at the time, in decent shape, and I figured I could handle it if I paced myself. The route I picked wasn't the most popular one. Most people preferred the loop closer to the main park entrance, but I wanted something more isolated. I found a stretch of trail on the map that cut into the backcountry, climbing steadily through miles of dense forest. The ranger station marked it as lightly maintained, which meant fewer people went that way. That was exactly what I wanted. Peace, solitude, silence away from the usual weekend crowd. I packed carefully the night before. A sturdy tent, a good sleeping bag, a decent water filter, and enough food for several days. My backpack felt heavy when I hoisted it, but I told myself I'd get used to the weight after a few miles. I went to bed early and tried to sleep, but my mind ran with excitement and a small hint of nerves. There's always a quiet kind of fear that comes with doing something new alone, especially in the wilderness. I told myself that was part of the thrill. The morning I set out, the weather was clear and cool. The air had that crisp bite you get early in the day before the sun warms everything up. I parked my car near the ranger station, double-checked my gear, and signed the logbook. It was something they required, writing your name, the trail you plan to take, and your estimated return. At the time, it felt routine, but later I would think about that entry more than once. The first few miles were easy. The trail wound gently through tall pines and patches of hardwood. The forest smelled damp and earthy, the kind of smell that only comes after a week of light rain. My boots sank slightly into the soft soil, and every step felt cushioned. Birds called from high branches, and I could hear the faint rush of a stream somewhere nearby. Felt peaceful. I carried a steady pace, focusing on my breathing and the weight of the pack on my shoulders. By midday, I reached a small clearing where sunlight broke through. I took my pack off and sat on a fallen log, eating a protein bar and drinking from my water bottle. Sweat clung to my back, and I stretched, feeling the muscles in my legs tighten. I checked the map, running my finger along the dotted line that marked the trail. Everything looked straightforward, and I felt confident about where I was heading. The trail grew narrower as I continued. Ferns brushed against my legs, and thorny branches reached across the path. It was clear this section didn't get much foot traffic. The ground was uneven, scattered with loose rocks, and I had to watch my footing. A couple of times I stumbled but caught myself. I reminded myself that twisting an ankle out here would turn things bad quickly. By late afternoon, I had covered more ground than I expected. My legs ached, but I felt good about my progress. I looked for a spot to camp before dark. The forest grew denser the farther I went, and the undergrowth was thick. After some searching, I found a flat patch of ground beneath a cluster of tall trees. The soil was firm, and there was enough open space to set up my tent. I dropped my pack with relief and began unpacking. As I worked, I noticed how quiet it was. The usual bird calls had faded, and only the occasional rustle of leaves broke the silence. I brushed it off, telling myself it was just evening settling in. After setting up the tent, I gathered some dry wood and built a small fire in a safe ring of stones. The smoke rose slowly through the branches, and I sat back, feeling the warmth on my face. That night, as I lay in my sleeping bag, I listened to the forest. At first, I heard the distant snap of twigs, the call of an owl, and the faint shuffle of some small animal in the brush. But as the hours dragged on, the sounds changed. There was something heavier moving at the edge of camp. A branch cracked sharply, much louder than what a rabbit or raccoon would make. My heart thumped as I held my breath, straining to listen. Past eventually, the sounds grew distant, and I told myself it was probably a deer. I tried to relax, but sleep came slowly. Every small noise seemed louder when you were alone in the woods. The next morning, I packed up and continued. My muscles were stiff and I moved slower at first, but the rhythm came back. The trail climbed more steeply now, winding along ridges where the trees thinned. At certain points, I could look out over the forest and see endless waves of green stretching to the horizon. It was beautiful, but it also reminded me how far I was from anyone else. By the second night, things started to feel different. I had set up camp in another small clearing and was sitting by my fire when I noticed something strange. There were footprints in the dirt not far from where I set my tent. At first, I thought they were mine, but when I compared them to the tread on my boots, they didn't match. They were larger, wider, and the pattern was different. My stomach tightened. I crouched down, examining them in the fading light. They looked fairly fresh, maybe from earlier that day. They weren't animal tracks, too clean, too human. I stood there for a long moment, my eyes darting around the trees. Nothing moved, but I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. That night, I barely slept. Every sound put me on edge. I kept imagining someone walking silently just beyond the firelight, circling the camp. My ears played tricks on me, making shapes out of silence. At one point, I thought I heard the faint snap of a branch close by. I sat up in my tent, heart pounding, holding my flashlight tightly. But the sound faded, and eventually, exhaustion forced me to lie back down. The following day, I felt drained. I kept moving, but my focus wasn't on the trail anymore. My eyes kept flicking behind me, scanning for movement. I couldn't stop thinking about the footprints. Maybe it was just another hiker. Maybe someone else had passed through. But the trail was supposed to be lightly maintained, and I hadn't seen another person since I started. The thought of someone out there, following or watching me, dug deep into my mind. By late afternoon, I reached a section of trail that dipped into a ravine. The ground was damp, and a narrow stream cut through the bottom. I crossed carefully on wet rocks, my boots slipping slightly. On the other side, I paused and looked back. That's when I saw it. A figure stood at the top of the ravine, partly hidden behind the trees. It was too far to see clearly, but I could make out the shape of a person standing still, watching. My chest tightened. I froze, staring back, waiting for them to move. For a long moment, neither of us moved. Then, as I blinked, the figure stepped back into the trees and vanished. I stood there shaking, trying to convince myself I had imagined it. Maybe it was just the shape of a tree, a trick of the light. But deep down, I knew I hadn't imagined it. Someone had been standing there, watching me. I forced myself to keep moving, but every instinct screamed at me to turn back. The problem was I was already too far in. Going back would take just as long as pushing forward. I decided to keep going, hoping I was just overthinking it. That night, I didn't light a fire. I set up my tent quickly, ate a cold meal, and sat in the darkness, listening. The woods felt alive around me, but not in the peaceful way they had before. Every rustle seemed deliberate, every snap of a branch intentional. I sat with my knife in hand, heart hammering, waiting for something to happen. Hours passed. Then, sometime deep into the night, I heard it. Footsteps. Slow, careful, deliberate. They moved around the edge of my camp, crunching softly on the ground. My mouth went dry as I gripped the knife tighter, my entire body frozen. The steps circled, then stopped. I held my breath, straining to hear. For a long time, there was nothing. Then, faintly, the sound of retreating steps, fading into the forest. I didn't sleep at all that night. The next day, I decided I needed to get out as soon as possible. I packed quickly and moved fast, barely stopping to rest. My eyes scanned constantly, searching for any sign of movement. I felt exposed, vulnerable, like prey being tracked. As the sun dropped lower, I pushed myself harder, desperate to cover more ground. My legs burned, and my pack dug into my shoulders, but I couldn't stop. I knew someone was out there. Someone was following me. By evening, I stumbled onto a section of the trail that looked more used. The dirt was packed tighter, and I saw fresher boot prints. Relief washed through me. Maybe I was getting closer to the main loop, closer to other hikers. But then I saw something that froze me in place. On the trunk of a tree ahead, carved deep into the bark, were letters. My name. My blood ran cold. I stared at it, my stomach twisting. Someone knew my name. Someone had been I always thought hiking was a way to escape the noise of life. The woods, the mountains, the trails. They gave me a sense of quiet that I couldn't find anywhere else. I had hiked alone many times before, sometimes for a few hours, sometimes for days, and I always carried the right gear, water, food, and a map. I told myself that as long as I was careful, I would be fine. But I learned the hard way that being alone in the wilderness is not always peaceful. Sometimes it's the opposite. The trip I'm about to describe happened 2 summers ago. I had taken a few days off from work and decided I would spend them hiking a trail that was not very well known, but had been described in a few online forums as remote but beautiful. That phrase had stuck in my mind. Remote but beautiful. At the time, it sounded perfect. The trail was in a national forest, far enough away from towns that cell service dropped out completely. I had prepared by printing a physical map of the area, marking the trailhead, possible campsites, and water sources. The plan was to hike in for a full day, camp overnight, then turn back the next day. A short but refreshing trip. I parked my car at the small dirt pull-off near the trailhead. It was mid-morning, sunny, and warm. There were no other cars around, which gave me a strange mix of excitement and unease. I liked solitude, but knowing I was the only one starting out that morning made me feel more exposed. Still, I hoisted my pack onto my shoulders, checked my water, and started down the narrow trail. The first few hours were beautiful. The trail wound through thick forest, with patches of sunlight breaking through the leaves. The ground was dry and firm, pine needles crunching softly under my boots. Birds called overhead, and now and then I heard the scurrying of small animals in the underbrush. I felt relaxed. After about 3 hours, the trail grew steeper. I climbed higher into the forest, and the trees thinned, giving way to occasional views of the valley below. I stopped to eat a quick snack, taking in the view, and then pressed on. The deeper I went, the quieter it became. Bird calls grew less frequent, and the sound of the wind through the trees was the only steady noise. By mid-afternoon, I came across a small clearing with a fire ring made of stones. It was clearly used as a campsite. I marked it in my mind for later in case I decided to stop there. My plan was to hike for at least 2 more hours before setting up camp, but I always liked to know my options. The trail beyond that point grew narrower and less maintained. Fallen branches blocked parts of it, and I had to step over them carefully. In some spots, tall grass and weeds almost obscured the path. It was obvious not many people hiked this section. As the sun began to sink lower, I started thinking about where to camp. I wanted to be settled before dark. After another hour of hiking, I found a flat area just off the trail with enough open space for my tent. It wasn't as established as the earlier clearing, but it would work. I set down my pack, stretched my shoulders, and began unpacking. I had the tent up in about 15 minutes. After that, I collected some fallen wood to make a small fire. Even though I had a stove, I liked the comfort of a fire when I was out alone. I cooked a simple meal, ate slowly, and listened to the forest settling around me. The air cooled quickly, and by the time the sun had fully set, the woods were a wall of darkness beyond the glow of my fire. The first strange feeling came when I was getting ready to climb into my tent. I had doused the fire, brushed my teeth, and zipped up my gear when I suddenly felt watched. The kind of feeling that prickles the back of your neck. I paused, listening. The forest was silent, too silent. I told myself it was just nerves. Being alone in the woods at night can do that to you. I forced myself into the tent, zipped it shut, and lay down in my sleeping bag. For a while, I lay awake, listening. My ears strained for any sound. Footsteps, branches snapping, movement. At one point, I thought I heard something faint in the distance, like a stick breaking, but it was so soft I convinced myself it was just the forest shifting. Eventually, I drifted into uneasy sleep. I woke up sometime in the night to a sound outside my tent. A slow, steady crunch of leaves. My eyes snapped open in the darkness. My heart pounded so hard I thought it might give me away. The sound was real. I held my breath and listened. It wasn't the scurrying of a small animal. It was heavier, deliberate. Someone or something was moving outside. I lay completely still, afraid to make even the slightest noise. The footsteps came closer, circling the area where my tent stood. Then they stopped. Silence pressed in all around me. My chest ached from holding my breath, but I didn't dare move. After what felt like forever, I heard the sound again, moving away this time, slow and careful until it faded. I didn't sleep for the rest of the night. I just lay there, frozen, waiting for it to return. But it didn't. When dawn finally broke, I unzipped my tent slowly and peered out. The campsite looked normal. No tracks, no disturbed items, nothing to suggest someone had been there. I almost convinced myself I had imagined it. But the memory of those deliberate footsteps was burned into me. I debated turning back, but stubbornness kept me going. I told myself I had planned this trip for weeks, and I wasn't going to cut it short over one uneasy night. So I packed up, shouldered my pack, and pressed further down the trail. As the hours passed, I noticed something odd. I felt like I wasn't alone. Several times, I stopped and listened, certain I heard movement behind me. Each time, the forest went still. At one point, I swore I caught sight of something between the trees. A flicker of motion, maybe a shape, but when I focused, it was gone. The more it happened, the more paranoid I became. I checked behind me constantly, scanning the trail, the trees, the shadows. My pace quickened. My throat was dry even though I was drinking water. By mid-afternoon, I realized I was too tense to enjoy the hike anymore. My plan to go deeper suddenly seemed foolish. I decided I would turn back and make camp at the clearing I'd seen earlier, then hike out the next day. When I finally reached that clearing, I felt a rush of relief. It was open with good visibility in all directions. I set up my tent close to the fire ring and quickly gathered wood. I wanted a big fire that night. I built it higher than I usually would, the flames crackling and throwing sparks into the air. I sat close, the heat comforting. But as the sun dipped and the forest darkened, the unease returned. I kept glancing toward the tree line, half expecting to see someone step out. Nothing happened, but the silence was suffocating. I forced myself into my tent when it was fully dark, leaving the fire burning low outside. Again, I woke in the night. This time, the sound was unmistakable. Footsteps, slow and careful, circling my camp. My blood turned cold. Whoever or whatever it was, they were back. I sat upright in my sleeping bag, straining to hear. The steps came closer, stopping just outside my tent. I heard the faint sound of breathing, human breathing. I froze. My mind raced. Should I make a noise, scare them off, or stay quiet and hope they left?
Il chose silence.
Minutes dragged by. The breathing faded, the footsteps retreated, and eventually there was only silence again. I didn't sleep. I sat there clutching my knife until dawn. When morning came, I packed up as fast as I could. I didn't eat breakfast, didn't stop for water, just stuffed everything into my pack and got moving. I wanted out of those woods. The hike back felt endless. Every sound behind me made me whip around. Several times I thought I saw someone in the distance, but when I blinked, they were gone. My nerves were frayed raw. Finally, After hours of near jogging down the trail, I saw the dirt pull off where my car was parked. Relief surged through me. I practically ran the last stretch. But when I reached my car, my relief turned to ice. There were fresh footprints in the dirt around it. Large, boot-shaped prints circling my vehicle, stopping at the driver's side door. I fumbled my keys, unlocked the door, and threw my pack inside. My hands shook as I started the engine. I didn't even look back as I sped away down the dirt road, heart hammering, eyes flicking to the rearview mirror every few seconds. I don't know who was out there. I don't know if they followed me or if they were just messing with me. All I know is that I wasn't alone on that trail, not for a single moment after that first night. Since then, I haven't hiked alone again. I stick to busy trails with other people around. Sometimes I still wake up in the night, hearing those slow, deliberate footsteps in my mind, circling me in the dark, and I wonder if whoever it was that followed me is still out there, waiting for the next person to wander too far into those woods alone. I had been planning the hiking trip for a long time. It wasn't supposed to be anything extreme, just a few days out in the mountains to clear my head and get away from everything. I had been carrying around stress from work, and my sleep had been poor. Hiking had always been the thing that made me feel better, so I convinced myself this trip would help reset my mind. I picked a trail system in a mountain range that was known for being rugged, but also beautiful. It wasn't one of those tourist-heavy areas with packed parking lots and snack shops near the start. This was the kind of place where you could go hours without seeing another person. That's what I wanted at the time, solitude. I spent the night before checking and rechecking my gear. Tent, sleeping bag, water filter, stove, food, headlamp, backup batteries, maps, compass, extra layers. I packed carefully, thinking through everything, and weighed my pack several times until it felt balanced. My plan was to hike in about 10 miles the first day, set up camp near a small alpine lake I saw on the map, and then push further into the backcountry the next day. I felt good about the plan. The morning I set out was clear and cool. I parked my car at the small gravel pull-off near the start of the trailhead. Only 2 other cars were there. That made me feel even better, knowing I'd mostly have the place to myself. The trail started out wide and easy, with a steady climb that let me warm up quickly. I found myself getting into a rhythm, counting steps, listening to the crunch of dirt under my boots, breathing in the sharp scent of pine and wet earth. The higher I went, the quieter it got. No traffic noise, no hum of phones, nothing except the occasional call of a bird or the rustle of wind through the trees. It was exactly what I wanted. For the first few hours, I felt at peace. I stopped often to drink water and check the map. The trail wound up switchbacks, through groves of aspens that were starting to turn yellow, and into darker, thicker pines. By midday, clouds had started to move in. They weren't storm clouds, just the gray, heavy kind that make the forest look darker. I ate a quick lunch sitting on a rock near a clearing, then kept going. The climb was harder now, and I felt the weight of my pack more. Sweat cooled on my back each time I stopped, and I tried to keep moving to stay warm. Around mid-afternoon, I reached the lake I had marked. It was smaller than I expected, ringed by boulders and trees that leaned over the water. The surface was dark and still, reflecting the clouds. It looked like a good place to stop. I found a flat patch near the tree-line and set up my tent. After filtering water and eating, I sat for a long time just staring out across the water. That night was quiet, too quiet. I woke up several times, not from any noise, but from the sheer stillness. No wind, no frogs or insects, just the occasional drip of water from a tree branch onto my tent. Each time I woke, I listened hard, trying to figure out why I felt uneasy. There was nothing obvious. I told myself I was just not used to being alone in such silence. The next morning, I felt heavy. I didn't sleep well, and the quiet had gotten under my skin. I shook it off, packed up, and decided to push deeper. My map showed another lake further in, with a ridge that offered good views of the surrounding mountains. I told myself that would be worth it. The trail got rougher the further I went. Roots, rocks, and overgrown sections slowed me down. I stopped checking my phone because there was no signal. I relied fully on the map and compass, making sure I was still on track. By midday again, I reached the ridge. The view was stunning. Jagged peaks in the distance, forested valleys dropping away on either side. But there was something else too. A faint trail, unmarked on my map, leading down one side of the ridge into a thicker section of forest. It looked less traveled, overgrown in spots. Curiosity pulled at me. I hesitated, knowing my plan didn't include this. But standing there, with hours left of daylight, I convinced myself to at least follow it a short way. The further I went down that faint trail, the less it looked like a trail. It narrowed, winding between trees and boulders, until I was pushing through undergrowth. I should have turned back. I told myself it was fine, that I could just retrace my steps. But the trees closed in, and I didn't notice how quickly the light faded under the canopy. By late afternoon, I realized I couldn't find the ridge again. I checked my compass, but the terrain didn't match the map. The faint trail I thought I was following was gone, swallowed up by brush and shadows. Panic rose in me, sharp and cold. I forced myself to calm down, to stop and breathe. I told myself I wasn't lost, just turned around. But deep down, I knew I had made a mistake. I decided to set up camp where I was, figuring I could reorient myself in the morning. I found a small clearing and pitched my tent quickly, working by instinct. The forest around me felt wrong now. Every crack of a branch, every rustle of leaves, made me snap my head up. It wasn't the calm silence from the night before. This was heavy, oppressive. I barely ate. I crawled into my sleeping bag early, trying to convince myself that things would look different in the morning. But that night was worse. I woke again and again to faint noises. Not animals moving naturally through the forest, but something else. A snapping branch, a faint crunch of leaves, always distant, never close enough to see. I lay stiff in my bag, heart hammering, listening until the silence pressed in again. At dawn, I packed up fast and started walking in what I thought was the right direction. I tried to keep the sun on one side, but the trees made it impossible. Hours passed and nothing looked familiar. The more I walked, the more I felt watched. Couldn't shake it. I stopped several times to listen, holding my breath, and I could have sworn I heard something behind me, always stopping when I stopped. By midday, I had drained more water than I wanted to. I filtered more at a small stream, crouched low, trying to stay alert. My nerves were stretched thin. Every gust of wind sounded like footsteps. My pack felt heavier with each step. That evening, I came across something that froze me in place. In a clearing, half hidden under brush, was a tarp. Old, sun-faded, edges frayed. Near it were the remains of a fire pit, stones blackened from heat. My stomach dropped. It had clearly been there a long time, abandoned, but the sight of it filled me with dread. Someone had camped here before, and the way it was left made my skin crawl. I didn't touch anything. I moved on quickly, not wanting to stay near it. The third night was the worst. I set up my tent in a hurry, barely eating again. I lay in the dark, forcing myself to keep still, but sleep didn't come. At some point deep in the night, I heard it, clear this time. Footsteps, slow, deliberate, moving through the brush near my camp. My body locked. I lay flat, not daring to breathe too loudly. The steps moved, pausing, circling, then fading into the trees. I didn't sleep after that. I stayed awake until dawn, every muscle tight. When the light finally came, I packed up and left in a rush, barely checking the map, just moving. I was desperate to find the main trail again. My thoughts spiraled. What if I never found it? What if I kept circling deeper? The fear of running into whoever or whatever had been near my camp pushed me harder. By afternoon, my legs were shaking from exhaustion. My food was running low. I tried to ration, but my stomach ached. Then, finally, I saw something that gave me hope. A cut log, clearly sawed clean. Not natural. My heart jumped. I pushed on, and after another half hour, I stumbled onto a real trail. A real marked trail. Relief flooded through me so hard I almost collapsed. I followed it for hours until I reached a signpost, weathered but readable, pointing toward a trailhead. I wasn't done yet, but I knew I was safe. I kept walking, pushing my tired body until, just before nightfall, I reached a gravel lot with cars. My own wasn't there, since I had come out at a different trailhead miles from where I started. But seeing other cars made my throat tighten. I was back. I waited until morning, when a couple showed up at the lot to start their hike. I must have looked terrible, filthy, exhausted, sunken-eyed. They didn't ask questions, but they gave me a ride back down the mountain road to where my own car was parked. When I finally drove away, the mountains shrinking in the rearview mirror, I couldn't shake the feeling that I had barely gotten out. I kept thinking about the footsteps, the abandoned tarp, the silence of those nights. I still don't know if someone was out there following me, or if it was just my fear twisting everything. All I know is that I'll never go off trail like that again. That mistake almost kept me out there forever. Even now, whenever I close my eyes, I hear those footsteps circling my tent in the dark. It was late summer when I decided to head out alone for a long hike deep into the mountains. I had been wanting to push myself farther than before, away from the trails most people used, somewhere remote where the air felt untouched and the silence stretched for miles. I packed light but careful. My backpack held a small tent, sleeping bag, food for 3 days, a metal water bottle with a filter, a flashlight with extra batteries, a map folded so many times it was wearing thin at the edges, and a simple knife I always carried when camping. I left my phone off, tucked inside a dry bag, telling myself it was better to disconnect, better to be fully there in the woods without relying on reception I likely wouldn't get anyway. The first part of the trail was calm, almost too calm. The air was heavy with the smell of pine and soil, the ground damp from rain a few nights before. I could hear insects buzzing close to my ears, and the crunch of gravel under my boots was the loudest sound most of the time. As the hours passed, I noticed fewer signs of anyone else. No footprints in the dirt, no broken branches, no candy wrappers or plastic bottles people sometimes left behind. It felt like I had stepped off the map and into another world. That was exactly what I had wanted. The slope grew steeper and I slowed down. My legs burned with each step, sweat gathered under my shirt, and the straps of my backpack dug into my shoulders. I paused often to sip water and glance back, noticing how far down the valley I had come. The view was wide and empty. For miles, there was no sign of houses, no cars, no trails of smoke. I liked it, but part of me also felt a strange pressure in my chest knowing how alone I really was. By the time the sun was lowering, I had reached a ridge that overlooked 2 dark valleys stretching out in opposite directions. I chose the one that seemed less steep, reasoning it would be easier to descend in the morning. I set up my tent on a flat patch of dirt surrounded by rocks. The silence was sharp. I sat there eating a dry granola bar, listening to the faint rustle of trees and thinking about how different everything felt once daylight faded. That night was restless. Every little sound outside seemed too close. A snapping twig, the brush of something against the nylon wall of my tent. At one point, I was sure I heard footsteps, steady and spaced apart like a person walking. My heart hammered in my chest as I froze, clutching the knife inside my sleeping bag. The steps stopped after a while, and the silence came back, heavier than before. I told myself it was an animal, maybe a deer. Still, I barely slept. In the morning, fog covered the ground. I boiled a little water for coffee on my small stove, but I had no appetite. I packed up quickly, eager to move. As I started down into the valley, I noticed the ground was softer, almost marshy in places, and my boots sank deep into mud that clung to me. It slowed me down, but I kept moving, determined to reach a small river I had seen marked faintly on the map. By midday, the sun burned off most of the fog. The valley felt like a trap, walls of trees closing in on both sides, and the river sounded louder the closer I got. When I reached it, I felt a rush of relief. The water was clear and fast, winding between smooth stones. I refilled my bottle and let the cold water wash over my face. But then I noticed something strange. Across the river, in a patch of dirt between thick brush, were fresh boot prints. Not the wide round prints of hiking boots like mine, but narrow, long, almost like work boots. The tread was deep, pressed firmly into the ground. They weren't washed out or old. Someone had been there recently. My chest tightened as I stared at them. I hadn't seen another person since I started. I looked around, scanning the trees, but nothing moved. No voices, no sound of someone else. I stood there longer than I should have, trying to decide what it meant. Maybe a hunter had passed through. Maybe a ranger, though I doubted rangers came this deep into the forest. Eventually, I forced myself to keep moving, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't as alone as I thought. The trail, if it could be called that, grew rougher. Fallen logs blocked my way, and thorn bushes clawed at my arms when I tried to push through. My legs grew tired faster, and the heat pressed down harder than before. I tried to distract myself by thinking about how far I'd go before camping again, but I kept glancing behind me, convinced that if I looked hard enough, I would see someone moving through the trees. Hours later, I found a small clearing where I decided to set up camp. The ground was uneven, but I was too drained to keep searching. I ate jerky in silence, watching the tree lean. Again, the night dragged on with noises that felt wrong. Something large moved around just beyond my sight, heavy enough to crack branches. The longer I listened, the more convinced I became it wasn't just deer. At one point, I thought I heard breathing. The next morning, I packed as fast as I could. My nerves were shot. I wanted to finish the loop and get back to the main trail system before another night came. I followed the river upstream, but soon I realized I was no longer sure where I was. The map made less sense with each bend of the valley. What looked like a side stream wasn't marked, and the ridges around me all looked the same. That's when I saw it. Across a cluster of rocks, there was a small pile of bones. Animal bones, bleached white, stacked together in a way that didn't look natural. They were arranged in a crude pyramid, maybe knee-high with a larger skull set on top. It wasn't decorative, not neat or artistic. It looked careless but intentional. Someone had put them there. My stomach turned cold as I stared at it, realizing I was far from any place where that would make sense. I backed away, but my boot snapped a branch, the sound cracking loudly through the trees. In that moment, I felt sure I wasn't alone. I forced myself to keep walking, faster now, my eyes darting left and right. The forest pressed in closer, and I had no idea if I was still heading in the right direction. Not long after, I found another boot print, this time on my side of the river, fresh again, deeper than the ones before, like the ground was soft when someone walked there. The size was bigger than mine, longer, wider. My skin prickled as I crouched and traced the edge of it. Whoever made it wasn't far ahead. The sun dipped lower, and I panicked. I couldn't spend another night in the valley. I pushed hard, ignoring how tired I was. My legs trembled, and blisters burned inside my boots. When I finally stumbled onto a narrow deer trail, I followed it uphill, desperate to climb out of the valley. I didn't care if it took me off course. As the light faded, I saw movement between the trees above me. A figure, tall, broad-shouldered, standing still against the fading sky. My chest seized up, and I froze. I couldn't make out details, just the outline of someone watching. Then, in a blink, the figure stepped back and was gone. I don't remember the next few minutes clearly. I just know I scrambled upward, branches scratching my arms, rocks sliding under my boots. My breath came in gasps, and the sound of my heartbeat roared in my ears. When I reached the top, I didn't stop. I pushed on until darkness swallowed the forest. That night, I didn't set up the tent. I just sat against a tree, clutching my knife, forcing myself not to close my eyes for more than a second. Every rustle made me flinch. Every shadow looked like a man standing still in the distance. I counted the hours until the first light bled into the sky. When morning came, I kept walking, driven by nothing but the need to get out. My food was almost gone, and I hadn't slept more than a handful of minutes. My legs shook with every step. I had no idea if I was heading toward the trailhead anymore. By midday, I stumbled onto a wide dirt road, rutted with tire tracks. Relief hit me so hard I nearly dropped to my knees. I followed it, and eventually it led out of the trees to a gravel parking lot where 2 empty trucks were parked. I recognized the name of the lot on a faded wooden sign. I was miles from where I had planned to finish, but it didn't matter. I was out. I never saw anyone on that road, never saw the figure again. But the image of it standing on the ridge stayed burned into my mind. The stacked bones, the prints, the way the nights felt heavy with presence. I couldn't explain any of it in a way that made me feel better. All I knew was that I had gone out there looking for silence and distance, and I found something else. Something that reminded me how easily a person could disappear in those woods without a trace. I drove home in silence that night, my hands tight on the wheel, headlights cutting through the dark. I told myself I'd never go back to that area, and I haven't. Even now, years later, the thought of it makes my chest tighten. I learned that the wilderness isn't empty, no matter how alone you think you are. It was early in the morning when I decided to head out for a long hike. I had planned it for weeks, looking over maps and reading about the trail, trying to prepare myself as best I could. I wasn't new to hiking, but I also wasn't someone who could be considered an expert. I liked to go out alone because it cleared my head, but I knew it wasn't always the safest thing to do. I packed everything I thought I would need: food, water, a first aid kit, a flashlight, a knife, a fire starter, and a small tent in case I ended up having to stay out overnight. The pack was heavy, but I felt good knowing I had what I needed. The trail started off simple. It was flat at first, and the air was cool. The sun was just starting to rise, and the light cut through the trees in long, soft beams. Birds were singing, and for a while I felt calm. The dirt under my boots was damp from the dew, and the forest smelled fresh. I kept a steady pace, breathing in the cool air, watching the path wind ahead of me. The forest looked endless, but I had marked on my map where I wanted to go: a ridge that overlooked a valley. It was supposed to be a long, tough hike, but the view at the top was said to be worth it. The further I went, the more the trail narrowed. Roots cut across the path, rocks jutted out, and I had to watch my step constantly. My pack rubbed against my shoulders, and sweat started to soak through my shirt. I tried to keep drinking water slowly so I didn't run out too quickly. The sun climbed higher, and the shadows of the trees grew shorter. I could feel the warmth pressing down on me, and I pulled my hat low to keep the glare out of my eyes. Hours passed, and I had gone deeper than I realized. The trail markers weren't as clear anymore, just old paint on trees that looked faded. Some were missing completely. I pulled out my map a few times to check, but the terrain didn't always match perfectly with the lines on the paper. I tried to convince myself it was fine. I had a compass, and I thought if anything went wrong, I could just backtrack. By noon, the air felt heavy. My legs were sore, and I stopped to eat. I found a flat rock and dropped my pack down, sitting on it while I chewed slowly. The silence hit me then. There weren't many birds anymore, and the forest seemed too still. I brushed it off, thinking maybe it was just the time of day. I packed up again and pushed forward, wanting to make it to the ridge before afternoon. The trail started to climb sharply. Loose gravel rolled under my boots, and I had to use my hands to steady myself on the rocks. My breathing grew heavy, and I felt sweat dripping into my eyes. I wiped it away and kept climbing. My arms and legs burned, but the thought of the view ahead kept me moving. Finally, after what felt like an endless climb, I reached a flat stretch. My heart was pounding, but I forced myself to slow down and take it easy. The ridge wasn't far now. I could see the tree line thinning ahead, and the light was stronger. When I finally stepped out, the valley opened up before me. It was huge, stretching out with layers of hills and green forests. The sunlight touched everything, making it look almost unreal. For a moment, I felt relief. I dropped my pack and stood there, breathing deeply, letting the wind cool my face. But that peace didn't last long. I looked at my watch and realized how late it was getting. I had spent more time than I thought, and if I didn't head back soon, I'd be hiking in the dark. I didn't want that. I grabbed my pack quickly and turned around, starting the descent. Going down was faster, but it was also trickier. The rocks were loose, and one wrong step could send me tumbling. That's when it happened. My boots slipped on the gravel, and before I could catch myself, my foot twisted hard. Pain shot up my leg, and I stumbled to the ground. I let out a groan, clutching my ankle, throbbed sharply, and when I tried to put weight on it, the pain was worse. My stomach sank. I knew I had twisted it badly, maybe even sprained it. Panic started to creep in, but I tried to calm myself. I sat there, breathing slowly, and checked it. It was swollen, and every movement sent a sting of pain through me. I knew I couldn't waste time. The sun was already dipping, and the forest was starting to darken. I forced myself up, leaning on a stick I found nearby. Every step hurt, but I kept moving. The trail looked different going down, less familiar, and I worried I might have taken a wrong turn somewhere. I tried to remember the landmarks, the trees, the rocks, but everything blended together in the fading light. As the sun sank lower, the forest grew darker. The air cooled quickly, and the shadows stretched across the path. I pulled out my flashlight and clicked it on. The narrow beam cut through the dark, but it also made everything feel more closed in. The sounds around me changed too. Branches cracked, leaves rustled, and it felt like the woods had come alive. I kept telling myself it was just animals, nothing more. The trail grew harder to follow. Some parts vanished into overgrowth, and I had to guess where it continued. My ankle slowed me down, and the weight of my pack felt heavier with every step. Fear began to build inside me. I was alone, hurt, and unsure if I was even on the right path anymore. The thought of spending the night out here hit me hard. After what felt like hours, I realized I was lost. The trail was gone. I turned in circles, shining my light in every direction, but nothing looked familiar. The forest was thick, and the silence pressed against me. My heart raced, and my throat felt dry even though I had water. I dropped my pack and tried to think. I pulled out the map and the compass, but in the dark, the lines and symbols blurred together. The panic made it worse. My hands shook, and the flashlight beam wobbled. I knew I had two choices: keep moving and hope I found the trail again, or stay put and wait until morning. The fear of the night kept me from staying still. I picked up my pack and kept limping forward. My flashlight beam caught glimpses of trees, rocks, and shadows that made my chest tighten. Every sound felt closer than it was. Branches snapping in the distance made me freeze more than once, straining to listen. Hours dragged by. My ankle was on fire, and I was exhausted. My water was running low, and my stomach growled from hunger. I felt the fear crawling deeper now, not just from being lost, but from knowing how vulnerable I was. If I couldn't find the trail soon, I would have to set up camp in the dark, alone, with every sound of the forest pressing in. Finally, I couldn't take another step. I found a small clearing and dropped my pack. My hands fumbled as I pulled out the small tent, trying to set it up with the flashlight between my teeth. Every second felt longer. Every rustle in the trees made me tense. When I finally crawled inside, I zipped it shut and sat there, listening to my heart pound. The thin fabric felt like it wouldn't stop anything from coming close. I lay there for hours, wide awake, every muscle stiff with fear. The night dragged on forever. My ankle throbbed and sleep wouldn't come. At some point, exhaustion won, and I drifted off, but every little noise snapped me awake again. When the first light of morning touched the tent, I felt a wave of relief. I crawled out, stiff and tired, but glad to see the sun. The forest looked less threatening in daylight, though the fear was still there. I packed up slowly, forcing myself to eat and drink, knowing I needed strength. With daylight, I could see more clearly. I used the compass and map again, and after moving carefully for hours, I finally found the trail again. Relief washed over me when I saw the old faded marker on a tree. My ankle still hurt, but I knew I could make it back now. Step by step, I pushed forward, the thought of safety pulling me along. The forest no longer felt endless. It felt like something I could finally get out of. By the time I reached the trailhead, I was drained. My clothes were dirty, my ankle swollen, my body aching, but I felt a strange mix of fear and relief. I had made it out. The The memory of that night stuck with me, though. The helplessness, the fear of being lost in the dark with no one around. I realized how quickly things could turn dangerous out there, even without anything supernatural, even without anyone else involved. It was just me, the forest, and the mistakes I made.